Randall O'Toole is an American public policy analyst whose work is focused on public land, regulation, and transportation. He's written 6 books, at least last bio I checked, 6 books, plus dozens of policy papers, many articles, op-eds about essentially free market approaches to various issues. And he goes by the moniker the Antiplanner. And if you want to learn more, he has his own Wikipedia page. Welcome, Randall.
Glad to be here.
Tell me about the Antiplanner. Where did this come from?
Well, I realized after about 30 years of working on these issues that all the environmental and social issues I was working on really had the problems with those issues really came from government planning, government attempting to plan for other people's land and resources, government attempting to tell people what to do, government attempting to do long range, like 20 or 50-year plans, and government planning to spend huge amounts of money on mega projects based on the flimsiest of evidence. And so really all of my career, which is now over 50 years, has been fighting bad government plans, which to me is redundant. All government plans are bad unless they are really narrowly focused. For example, if you are a highway agency and you're planning for your highways, that's fine. If you're a railroad agency and you're planning for your railroads, that's fine. But if you're planning for somebody else's highways or railroads, or if you're planning for somebody else's land, then you're going to have serious problems.
So I think this would be a really good place to start the discussion because especially when you think about having debate rounds, perhaps just this frame of, government planning, especially for big projects, is bad. That alone could be a good reason to reject especially these large-scale HSR proposals. So I guess in terms of small government, how do you think about the role of government in larger projects? Should it have no role? But I mean, what about things like the national highway system? What about things like war, like fighting climate change? Isn't big government better in some contexts?
Well, big government is rarely good in any context. And if you can substitute markets for government, you're much better off. Just as an example, the transcontinental railroads were built in the 19th century, and they all pretty much went bankrupt when they were government subsidized. The Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Santa Fe, the Northern Pacific, they all went bankrupt. Well, the Southern Pacific almost went bankrupt, but it was subsidized by another railroad and survived. But the others all went bankrupt. The first transcontinental railroad that didn't have serious financial problems was also the first one that was built without government subsidies, and that was the Great Northern. It was built to provide transportation. All the others were built to get the subsidies. And so they were built too soon. They were built in places that couldn't support rail and the cost of rail, and they just failed. Fast forward to the 20th century. For various policy reasons, Americans decided that highways should be built by government rather than by private. I mean, in the 19th century, most roads had been privately built, but they decided in the 20th century to be built by government. I would argue that the government could, or private industry could build roads, but let's go along with government ownership and construction of roads. The caveat was that the road construction would be paid for by the users out of gas taxes, vehicle registration fees, and other highway use fees. When Congress created the interstate highway system in 1956, it had a lot of restrictions. One was that they couldn't borrow money in an expectation of getting the user fees. They could only build as the user fees came in. So if nobody used them, then there wouldn't be any money to build them. Another restriction was that it would be built exclusively out of user fees. There would be no tax subsidies on a 50-50 match or a 10-20, 10-90 match or any other subsidies. It would all come exclusively out of user fees. And so built out of user fees on a pay-as-you-go basis, we ended up with this 48,000 mile highway system that carries about 20% of all passenger travel and 20% of all freight in this country. It's only a little more than 1% of all the miles of highways in the entire country, and yet it carries a huge percentage of all the freight and passengers. Now then, in 2009, President Obama said he wanted to build high-speed rail, and he made it clear that he wanted to model the high-speed rail system after the interstate highway system. Dwight D. Eisenhower is considered the father of the interstate highways, and Barack Obama wanted to be the father of America's high-speed rail system. But he forgot about those principles. He said, we are going to subsidize the construction. We are not going to expect that any user fees will ever recover any of the costs of construction. We aren't even going to expect that user fees are going to cover the cost of operating the high-speed rail lines. And so there's going to be huge subsidies going into it. People who are never going to ride the trains are going to have to pay in taxes to build them. And when you start with a system like that, everything goes out of control. The people who are building it know that the government's going to pay for it, so they don't try to control costs, and costs just ballooned. And 12 years later, we essentially have, after spending that $12 billion plus billions of dollars of state and local matching funds, we essentially have no faster trains and no more trains than we did in 2009.
So one rebuttal to this argument would be that despite the setbacks and hurdles, even particular things about the American system, HSR does work well in other countries. Now, it doesn't work economically, which is to say it's not a good business. The government doesn't make their money back. But in terms of generating boost for the economy, providing people with jobs, and just an improvement in everyone's quality of life, not to mention things like, this is probably the big one, reduced emissions from cars and highways. HSR seems to work in notably Europe, China, and Japan. Are there particular things about America that make it so that we can't compare ourselves to these countries? And if so, is it mostly just about our politics? I mean, China, for example, has been lauded for their extreme central power for being able to get mega infrastructure projects done like HSR, but also like their high build out of highways, or things like planting huge belts of trees across the country to fight dust storms and climate change, things like this. So how do you see that comparison between USA and China, or USA and other countries?
Well, first of all, I have to question your thesis that high-speed rail works in those other countries. And you have to ask, well, how do you define works? If you subsidize something enough, people are going to use it. And does that mean it's working? And I would say no. If you have to bribe people to use it, then it really isn't working that well. The fact is that when Japan opened its first high-speed rail line in 1964, the United States already had superior technology. 6 years before that, the Boeing 707 went on its first commercial flight. And immediately thereafter, the DC-8 went on its first commercial flight. They were 4 times faster than the top speed of Japan's high-speed train, and about 6 to 8 times faster than the average speed of the high-speed train. They were twice as fast as the top speed of the fastest high-speed trains today, and about 3 times as fast as the average speed of those trains. And to boot, they were less expensive. They didn't require huge amounts of precisely built infrastructure. Airplanes basically need a landing field. That's the only infrastructure they need. If they're successful, then you can build fancy airports with jetways and restaurants and moving walkways and things like that. And if they're not successful, then you can live with just having a field for them to land in. And I've flown in plenty of planes that just land in a bare field, and they open up the door and you walk down a couple of steps and walk out of doors until you find a vehicle to get in and go away, or bicycle away, or whatever. So you don't need a lot of infrastructure for planes. You need a huge amount of infrastructure for high-speed rail. Now, the next question is, having decided to subsidize high-speed rail, how does that work for them? Well, the problem is that if you're politically subsidizing something, then you've got political pressures to build it everywhere. Japan's first high-speed rail line went from Tokyo to Osaka, and they claim that it made money. And their proof of that is that they repaid the World Bank loans that were made to them to build it. But the World Bank loans only covered 11% of the cost of construction. And the Japanese National Railways that built it had been earning profits in almost every year before it was built, and they never earned a profit again after it was built. Part of the reason was that politicians in Japan demanded that they build more lines to smaller and smaller communities until they were spending billions of dollars on lines that reached communities of a few 100,000 people. And all of those lines lost money. And the same thing has happened in Spain and other countries that have built high-speed rail. If the government starts building it, then there's going to be political pressures to expand it to places where it makes no sense at all, even if the places where it started building it, it only made half sense. Just as an example, here in the United States, in 2009, President Obama presented a 8,500-mile high-speed rail plan that only went to a few cities. It didn't go to Phoenix. It didn't go to Denver. It didn't go to Salt Lake City, and didn't connect many cities. Like there were high-speed rail lines to Houston, but you couldn't get from Houston to San Antonio. There were high-speed rail lines to Seattle, but you couldn't get from Seattle to Los Angeles on high-speed trains. So there was several disconnected routes. And then a year later, he produced a new high-speed rail map that now had 12,500 miles on it, now had a high-speed rail line to Las Vegas, to Phoenix, to several other cities that weren't on the previous line, including such cities as Cheyenne, Wyoming, Duluth, Minnesota. Why Duluth? Well, it turns out the chairman of the House Transportation Committee at the time was representing Duluth. So he added Duluth to make that guy happy. So once you start building it, you end up in a terrible swamp of having to build less and less productive lines, and then you just end up with huge debts. Japan, by 1987, Japan National Railways had something like $300 billion of debts, and it was clearly never going to be able to pay back those debts. So the government had to absorb the debts. It broke it up into several different companies, sold the high-speed rail lines to the supposedly privatized companies at a tiny fraction of the cost of construction. And now they're operating them. And some of them say they're making money. Some of them aren't. But the ones that are making money bought the lines for pennies on the dollar for construction. Spain is having serious financial problems, partly because they've decided to build high-speed rail lines to every capital, provincial capital in the country, whether it needs it or not. China has, the national government has about a $1 trillion debt for high-speed rail, and that's matched by provincial governments in China that have another $1 trillion in debts for building high-speed rail. Nobody ever expects those debts to be repaid out of high-speed rail fares, and nobody knows where the tax dollars are going to come to repay them. And that's going to create serious financial problems for China in the future. So by not building high-speed rail, we've managed to avoid the financial stresses that have impacted the countries that have built it.
I want to run by you three potential alternatives for this money and just get your feedback. First, how about private investment in HSR? Are you opposed to this in any way, or is the core of your opposition the big government part? Second, investing in our normal trains, because we have a lot of normal trains. And third, as I believe you have written about, further investment in highways.
Well, I support further investment in highways because I think it will be productive, but I also only support it if it comes out of highway user fees. I do not want to see any tax dollars, whether federal, state, or local, going for highways. I wouldn't object if somebody proposed to build a high-speed rail line with private money, and there have been a few proposals. I think those proposals are based on totally bogus ridership projections and construction cost projections, and most of those proposals have fizzled. The one exception is Brightline, which goes from Miami to West Palm Beach, and they're building now to Orlando. And it's not really high-speed rail. It's what I would call medium-speed rail. It's like 120 miles an hour from West Palm Beach to Orlando, and 90 miles or 80 miles an hour from Miami to West Palm Beach. One problem that they're encountering is that they're building the part from Miami to West Palm Beach is on the same tracks that freight trains use, and they haven't bothered to fence them, and they haven't put up really good crossing gates. And so it's the most dangerous railroad in America. I think they've killed about 50 or 60 people since opening it up.
Oh, geez, I had no idea about that.
Yeah, it's horribly dangerous. And of course, they always blame the people who are getting killed for being on the tracks when the train comes. But this is a place that used to run 30-mile-an-hour freight trains, and now they're running 80-mile-an-hour passenger trains. And probably the freight trains only went at night, and they've got like 6 or 8 passenger trains a day. And so people are getting surprised, and they need to have better crossing gates. They need to have better fencing, and they're just too cheap to do that. They say they'll be glad to do it if the government pays for it. So even though it's not subsidized, they want a subsidy.
So final substantive question on your work. Again, your work is going to be probably the major piece of evidence, especially given how well you write. It's just a pleasure. If you're in a debate room and you want to read something good in front of a judge, reading your work is just so well written. It's convincing.
Thank you.
And you speak just the same way. So I think a lot of this can also be used by students. Some people are better writers than speakers. You seem to be excellent at both. But there is some evidence in the debate community linking you to interest in oil and gas through your Thoreau Institute, having taken donations from other organizations connected to maybe to big money. And in general, not just you in particular, but in general, there's a lot of pushback from special interest groups related to automobile, oil and gas, and airlines to HSR. So what do you make of this opposition and of the claims that you've been corrupted by oil money?
Well, I wish they were true, because if I had been corrupted by oil money, I'd have a lot more money than I do. And basically, the only person who once ever offered me a bribe was somebody advocating light rail. And they said they thought the company he worked for would give me a substantial bribe if I would promise to shut up talking about it. Unfortunately, I'd already convinced the mayor of that city to go against light rail, and so I didn't have an opportunity to say yes or no to that bribe. I have received grants from various sources, and some of those sources may have made some money from the oil industry, but they didn't give me any grants because of my positions on oil and gas or highways or anything else. They gave me the grants because they support free markets and small government. There's a lot of oil money going for the other side. I mean, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Pew Charitable Trust, they're giving money to people who are in favor of things like high-speed rail, and they made their money from the oil industry. Does that make them corrupt? I don't think so. I think there's a website called Light Rail Now. If you could ever dig up to find out where its money comes from, I bet it comes mainly from construction companies that make money building light rail. The thing is, if you build high-speed rail, that's hundreds of billions of dollars that's going to go into the pockets of contractors and workers. If you don't build it, that money isn't automatically going to be available for Amtrak or highways or anything else. We're talking about funny money here. We're talking about borrowed money that nobody knows will ever be able to pay back. And so It's not a choice of high-speed rail or building something else. It's a choice of high-speed rail or not going into debt as much. And so really the money side is the side that's in favor of building high-speed rail. The people who are against it are the ones who, like me, love trains. And I spend an enormous amount of my time studying the history of passenger trains in America. I even wrote a book about the history of passenger trains in America. I have a website that is all about the history of passenger trains in America. If I had no other form of transportation other than riding in a dome car and riding a bicycle, I'd be perfectly happy. I really don't like driving myself. But I have to look at reality and say, I'm a little weird. I'm not typical. Most Americans drive for most of their travel. We drive about an average of about 16,000 miles a year. We take Amtrak 19 miles a year on average. And that was before the pandemic. Now it's probably about 9.
Fantastic answer. Final question, sort of a thought experiment. So there is obviously a lot of romance in people's heads about HSR, right? The idea of it. And I think a lot of that comes from maybe traveling abroad and riding HSRs in different countries. And of course, it's a very pleasant experience because there's a lot of money put into the whole infrastructure. A lot of it's quite new. But a big difference, especially, when you think about Japan or Europe, is just the cities are built very differently, right? A lot of them are focused around transport, and also the cities were built out around, the train systems that exist for the older ones. So, trying to, let's say, money aside, trying to model Japan's situation would really entail restructuring our cities, not just building more rail, as difficult as that is even. So the question, I guess, is in an alternate universe where America had built HSR systems, along with Japan in the 1960s, do you think America would be a better place now?
No, and I think people, again, are misreading what's going on in other countries. They're guilty of what's called selection bias. If you go to Europe, as a tourist, it's a lot more convenient for you to ride around on trains than it is for you to rent a car. And you ride around on these trains and you look at them and there's a lot of other people on the trains. You think, oh, everybody's using the trains. In fact, only about 5% of all passenger travel in Europe is by train. And only a small percentage of that, maybe 40% of that is by high-speed train. And most of the other 95% is by automobile. They really aren't that much different from us. They've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on high-speed rail, and they haven't managed to get very many people out of their car. What they've managed to do is get people who are taking low-speed trains and putting them on high-speed trains. Air travel is growing far faster than rail travel in Europe. It's growing faster than rail travel in China, and I think it is in Japan. We don't really have good data out of either of those countries, but I think it's growing faster than rail travel in Japan. Now, on the other hand, we often hear people say, why is it that the United States has such a backwards rail system and everybody else has a more advanced rail system? And I would say, no, we have the most advanced rail system in the world. Number one, it's profitable. The United States and Canada have the only rail systems that are profitable in the world. And that's because, number two, they're private and they are based on moving freight. Now, one thing about moving passengers is that if you use rail, you might be able to save a few grams of greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile, but not a lot. Rail is only a little more efficient, and only if you fill up the trains, than it is than driving or flying. On the other hand, if you move freight by rail, you save like 95% of the greenhouse gas emissions versus moving that freight by truck. So how is freight moved in the United States versus Japan or Europe? Well, about 40% of all of our freight goes by rail. In Europe, it's about 16%. In Japan, it's about 4%. Most of their freight goes truck. So they're generating enormous amounts of greenhouse gases moving freight in order to save tiny amounts of greenhouse gases moving a few people by high-speed trains.
Apologize for the camera. Thank you. Excellent answer. And that's all I've got. So I appreciate your time, and I thank you in advance, because there are many, many students who will be using this interview, want to use your evidence, and you know, quotes from this interview will certainly be appearing in many debates across America. So thank you.
All right. Well, let me say one more thing.
Please, please.
If you go to my website, the Antiplanner, and you can Google Antiplanner, and I'm the first thing on the list, or you can go to ti.org/Antiplanner. Go to the upper right-hand corner, and it says Special Features, and click on that menu, and then click on Policy Briefs. I have 154-page policy briefs on various topics. Sort by topic and scroll down, and about 7 of them are on high-speed rail. A lot of them were done in the last year. And so they really have my latest thinking about high-speed rail, including ideas that you won't necessarily find in the paper that students already have.
Excellent, excellent resource. Again, that's ti.org/Antiplanner, right?
That's right. And anybody can email me at rot@ti.org, and I'll be glad to answer any questions people have.
That's extremely generous of you. Again, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.